good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. It is our great privilege to have as our guest this evening Ms. Jill Vialet. Give you a little bit of background on Jill before I turn over the floor to her. First off, she is the founder of Playworks, a nonprofit that partners with schools to promote physical activity and social and emotional health through play. She founded Playworks more than 25 years ago, and over that time, she and her team have built the organization to more than 500 staff members who serve more than 1 million students in thousands of schools across the US and in Ireland. So Jill matriculated at Harvard University, where she graduated with a degree in sociology and also had the opportunity to earn a teaching credential with the Cambridge Ringe and Latin School right near the Harvard campus. Many of you may not know Jill is an accomplished athlete, having won both the Maryland Mile and cross-country championships in high school, and a little bit later in life, the National Rugby Club Championships with the Berkeley All Blues. She did want me to tell you that she still runs to this day, albeit just maybe a little bit more slowly than she used to. She also didn't tell me to tell you that perhaps her greatest athletic accomplishment was winning the Harvard Intramural Crew Championship, but that's a story for another time. Prior to Playworks, she founded the Museum of Children's Arts, which was focused on making art a fundamental part of every child's life. Her most recent nonprofit, Substantial, is focused on helping school systems to better train and prepare substitute teachers for success in the classroom. Over the years, Jill has received numerous awards, including named by Forbes magazine as one of the top 30 leading social entrepreneurs, as well as being recognized by the Women's Sports Foundation as one of 40 women leaders on the anniversary of Title IX. Jill is the author of Recess Rules, a middle grade novel, and has 2 upcoming nonfiction books. The first is Substantial Classrooms, Redesigning the Substitute Teaching Experience, and Why Play Works, Big Changes Start Small. Finally, Jill and her partner Elizabeth have a blended family of 5 and live in Oakland, California. So please join me in giving a very warm digital Aggie welcome to our guest, Ms. Jill Vialet. Welcome, Jill.
Thanks, Joe. It's great to be here, although here is still home, which is always a little strange. But when you first reached out and you asked, would I be up for doing a talk about my sort of experience being a social entrepreneur, and specifically around the sort of questions about that the larger sort of speaker series focuses on around how will you be useful and what will you do to make the world better? I was pleased. It was nice to be asked, in no small part because I think in this moment when we are all in this sort of really kind of wild moment of deep societal transition, it's a lot of what I've been thinking about, and so thought I would jump in and tell a little bit about how I got here and a little bit about what I'm working on right now, and then looking forward to asking and being asked some questions with you. So I was at Harvard back in the 80s, and my first exposure to sort of social entrepreneurship and nonprofit work in general happened as an undergraduate. I met Wayne Meisel, who was starting Harvard's public service program, and he enlisted me. And Wayne went on to start the Campus Outreach Opportunity League, which was a whole national network, and very much at the vanguard of the national service movement. Wayne was a huge mentor, and I just would say at the outset, I wanted to mention him briefly because there was a way in which he encouraged me to be involved in a way that really emphasized a sort of irreverence and a playfulness in service that has just always stuck with me as being just critical, I think, to a lasting and sustainable career in the work. I think that it'll come up as a sort of theme for a lot of the choices I made through my career, but I think being sort of a joyful revolutionary, it is an intentional choice. And I feel really lucky that I had mentors early on who pointed me in that direction. I was deeply involved in college with the divestiture movement around South Africa. I wrote my thesis on reproductive health care in South Africa and was there in the summer of 1986. And so I was there under apartheid, which was a really formative experience. And when I graduated, I got a job doing social responsible investment, where I lasted for about 10 months and wrote the business plan for starting my first nonprofit, the Museum of Children's Art. Launched that and ran that for about 9 years. One of like my proudest sort of accomplishments is that actually at the wizened age of 24, I had an intern named Nina Woodruff, who was from Castlemont High School here in Oakland, and she is today the executive director of MoCA. And it was just one of those moments, thinking about it now and watching her emerge as the leader of MoCA, where you realize that the relationships we make and how you tend them and the care and sort of things that feel in the moment like, oh, I'd have this high school intern, no big deal. These are the kinds of decisions and friendships and relationships you make that actually can really change the trajectory of your life and the life of somebody else. So I ran MoCA for about 9 years, and it was just a huge education in nonprofit management. It's still alive and well in Oakland. And if you are in the area, I highly recommend. They've been doing some incredible porch talks, and Nina's been leading some extraordinary community conversations around racial equity in this moment and the role and power of art as a tool for helping communities really navigate this moment in time. So just super proud of how MoCA has evolved and grown and emerged as a really important community leader. When I left MoCA, I was pregnant with my oldest daughter, and I was ready to do something new. And it was actually sparked by having a conversation with a principal who had MoCA at her school, but was having this really desperate, challenging time with recess at her school. And she asked, couldn't I do something to help with recess the way that I had helped with the arts? And it was one of those moments where I was thinking about my own childhood and growing up in Washington, D.C., and how critical play had been in my life, that it felt like, yeah, I could make it possible to have someone like I'd had. In my case, there was a guy named Clarence who ran the Macomb Street playground after school every day. And I thought, every kid should get to have a Clarence. So started working just in a few schools in the East Bay. And over the course of the last 25 years, have really just had the chance to watch and be a part of Playworks growing dramatically. And it's been kind of a wild ride where we, at one point, right before the pandemic, we had 23 offices across the country. We had direct service programs going where we hired coaches who were working in the schools, as well as providing training, and been building out our digital platform. It really has been, I say it all the time, but leading and founding Playworks, there's no one has benefited as much from it as I have. And it just feels like it's been this extraordinary opportunity to learn so much. When the pandemic hit, we had a staff of about 510 people, and the nature of our business was such that we were about 60% earned revenue. And it meant that in the moment when all the schools closed, we needed to really bring all of our expenses to a screeching halt. And so we furloughed the vast majority of employees. We then got the PPP, which was dramatic and meant that we could bring people back on, but it also then, as we were preparing for this current school year, it just became increasingly clear that we were going to have to really contract dramatically. And so we went from about 510 staff to being just over 200. And I included myself in those layoffs, which was hard and yet very much the right thing to do. And it was time. I'd been there for 25 years and we'd grown in so many ways. Um, but I've been taking since that um, since that layoff in June, a lot of time to kind of look back and to ask questions about how might I be useful moving forward, and to try and make sense and meaning of all the lessons learned. Um, so that partly has been showing up in working on this new book, Why Play Works. So I've been kind of going through and looking at the different ways that actually leading an organization focused on play in the schools over the last 25 years has sort of laid bare in many ways a number of the different elements that are sort of engaged in a healthy society. So the book itself, I think it goes through everything from defining play to thinking about the implications of play on social emotional learning and promoting physical activity. It looks at play and safety and risk and how we navigate and manage those things and what play teaches us about that. Um, it talks about play and adults, both the adults that we interact with have, through Playworks out in the world at schools, but also our own staff and the other kind of corporate supporters and other humans, adult humans that we've kind of interacted with. I would say that one of the key lessons over the years of leading Playworks and launching in new cities and even bringing it to Ireland, um, kids all across the world are so similar in their willingness to sort of engage and to suspend disbelief that things aren't going to work. And grown-ups bring so many different um, sort of reservations and local sort of spins on their interpretation of what you're saying and what you mean. And so by far, if we could have figured out a way to start a business that really dealt directly with the kids, I think it would have probably scaled much more rapidly. The grown-ups have been, in many ways, the sort of most challenging part of leading a national organization focused on play. That said, also the book digs into sort of leadership and play and gender and race and how all of these things both show up when you're running play programs, but also that the different ways in which that play really contributes to helping us navigate social connection. I've been thinking that, without being a spoiler, I think that one of the things I'm really sort of coming to sort of the conclusion that why play works is the answer is that it helps us build sort of the muscles for justice, that it is in a lot of ways how we learn to practice the skills that actually enable us to grow up to be engaged citizens. Um, it's also an incredible, incredible as an entrepreneur backdrop against which to be sort of building a business. And I was thinking there's so many different ways in which, when I was learning more about the center and the work that you're doing there, that the experience of being the founder is extraordinary, but it on some level was secondary to our success, to the extraordinary efforts and like the unrelenting kind of work that all the staff across the country and in our national office that they put into being sort of the entrepreneurs who executed the plan. The big ideas feel like they're not a dime a dozen, but they don't feel like they feel like they get so much more attention than what I think is actually the magic sauce, which is in the coordination and the effort of the people who actually they do the translation from idea to reality. And I've been really struck by that. I did have the opportunity a few years ago. Joe mentioned that I co-founded another nonprofit a few years ago. I got to spend a year as a fellow at Stanford at the D School, where I was immersed for doing work around design thinking. And the way the fellowship worked that year was that you came with an idea, with a question you didn't quite know the answer to. And mine had sprung out of my experience at Playworks. And it was, how might we redesign the substitute teaching experience? And it was sparked because I kept having principals come up to me and, in a tone of quiet desperation, ask if they could borrow their Playworks coach to fill in as a sub. So it was an amazing opportunity to get to be immersed in human-centered design and to really have the luxury of the sort of the time and space to go through a process where you were doing deep empathy interviews and then taking the time to define the problem and then to really um, play with the ideas and synthesize the information before prototyping and testing and then rinsing and repeating. And I got to have a great experience. Some of the design students from UC Davis came out a couple of years ago, about a year and a half ago now, and helped really do a process where we looked at the new Playworks space and really figured out what could be the flow and how might design really think about space as a lever for promoting the kind of collaboration that we wanted in our work environment. And I just, having founded a few different nonprofits, I've been so struck by the different roles and capacities that different people bring, whether it's a deep financial knowledge, which is a key strategic sort of value to bring to bear in building effective nonprofits, but also design and really being a force for ensuring that we go through the process of defining the problem before jumping to solving it, because as humans, that is such our inclination. I guess the last thing, and then I wanted to then go and have a conversation, but the last thing I just wanted to mention is that in this last chunk of time during the pandemic, I've been just leaning in a lot to thinking about what's going on in the world around me, from the pandemic and how we're going to recover from a health perspective, thinking about how schools reopen and how we can take care of not only the kids and making sure they're safe, but also the adults. There's just a lot of trauma out there. And I think it's always been clear that we need each other and our messy interdependence is true. But I think in this moment, there's going to be such dueling pressure around sort of academic remediation and then sort of taking care of people's well-being that I worry about that tension and making sure that we just do it in a way that is sustainable and generous of spirit and inclusive. And then along those same lines, this has been a long time coming, but a moment of tremendous racial reckoning. And I think making sense of and unpacking a heightened awareness of the extent to which white supremacy culture is pervasive in a lot of our institutions, and figuring out as a white leader what I can do to be a part of moving forward in a way that is kind and respectful and appropriate, while also still being a joyful revolutionary with a lot to offer. It's a lot to address. It's a lot to do well, and it's inevitably somewhat uncomfortable. And it feels like it's worth saying out loud that inevitably I've come to terms with the fact that I'm going to make mistakes and do it wrong sometimes. And so that's hard. I have been turning a lot of my attention lately to democracy and its well-being. I got to work on the Biden-Harris political campaign after I stepped down from my role at Playworks. And that was an extraordinary opportunity for me to be a part of that. It felt like I made a contribution in a way that was good for me. I am a fan of political involvement of all stripes. And I think it's one of the things in the nonprofit sector that we have historically distanced ourselves from. And I think ultimately if systems change is where we want to go, that actually leaning into how politics work and being a force for innovation and an entrepreneurial mindset in both the short-term sort of systemic fixes that are needed in this moment, but also culturally upstream, how we actually build a culture of civic engagement that sustains us and our democracy. That feels like a really exciting opportunity for entrepreneurship to really move into a new area and discipline in a way that I think ultimately will not only benefit our democracy and the lives of our kids, but I think an entrepreneurial world, I think, is best served by an inclusive and healthy democracy. So those were all my many multi-directional thoughts, but I think I would just say that I learning more about all the work that's going on at Davis and the approach and just the commitment to by the students to actually be a part of making a difference and doing their best to contribute to a better world. It's inspiring, and I commend you, and I want to thank you, and I want to also offer my perspective, looking at a career that's somewhat in the rearview mirror. Um, I don't regret it for a minute. I just think I've been so lucky to have a career defined by making a difference, and some things I'm learning now that maybe I did unwittingly did some harm, but it's never too late to make decisions moving forward that really reflect a profound contribution. So that's what I got.
Thank you, Jill. That was fantastic. We appreciate that perspective very much, and of course, your willingness to, to share your time with us, and also willing to take questions. So that's a great segue for me. I have a few prepared questions for our guests, which I will provide in a moment. But I strongly encourage you, especially our students, but everybody who's participating, to please use the Q&A to ask your questions of Jill. And our team will curate those, and we will get to as many as we can. But this is an amazing opportunity to kind of, I'm 100% confident in saying this, hear it straight from Ms. Vialet, the unvarnished truth of that, there is no doubt. So Jill, there's lots of places I'd like to start, and I have enough questions that could easily filibuster the rest of our time, but we will get to student questions. But I have a couple, and first I want to start with a phrase you used in your talk, this idea of a joyful revolutionary. And I think that, we've seen some challenges recently and throughout history, right? And, change being lurching forward and sometimes backward. And we see the events of last year, kind of very painfully. Talk a little bit about this idea of a joyful revolutionary, especially for our students, our undergrads who, have grown up and are becoming adults in a very tumultuous time. How have you been able to be a joyful revolutionary?
Yeah, I've been thinking about it a lot, right? Because one wants to be respectful. Like the things going on in our world right now are very serious. Like it's not, there's no, and so, but how does one hold in a sustainable way, both the challenges we face with the respect that's required, while also figuring out how to create movements where that people are drawn to and where people want to be a part of. And I think there is a wisdom in laughter, right? And there is I think in terms of actually ultimately building something which has the sort of capacity to both affect lasting, meaningful change, while also being able to sustain the ups and downs. I just think that actually the joyful part is a critical and I think often overlooked piece. The other thing I'd say too is I'm struck by, when we first got AmeriCorps at Playworks, there was all this, we had a lot of internal discussion around the sort of ethos of service. And I think there's a potentially dangerous dynamic sort of that hints at noblesse oblige around like when one is serving and what that means. And I think it's true in business as well as in nonprofits, but I'm a fan of the sort of servant leader modelship, and I believe that the greatness sort of comes from service, and that you really do actually, it is almost universally true that the person serving gets more out of it than those who are served, and that And it's always been one of the great things about Playworks that, we'd hire these mostly young adults, and they'd go into schools and they got to be outside playing kickball all day. And like, and so often they would say, I can't, this feels like the biggest scam in the world, that this is I get paid to do this. This is awesome. And I honestly believe that attitude actually makes the quality of their interactions and their relationships, and thus the power of their service, that much greater.
Absolutely. That's a great way of putting it, Jill. I want to follow on that briefly. You talk about the young people that work, and others, but the young people in particular that work for Playworks. And you mentioned your talk, and you have in other talks about the importance of mentors, of role models for all children, but especially children that may be furthest from opportunity. As you see, sort of Playworks evolving over time, beyond that, the actual, play that happens at the schools. Talk to us a little bit about the role of these mentors and the relationship that they go through as young adults, kind of finding their way and their path towards having impact in society.
Yeah, I've thought about it a bunch. That I got into Playworks and I started it because I so identified with the students out in the school, and like I would have not lasted a day if I hadn't gotten to run around every day as a kid.
Yeah.
But I think what kept me at Playworks for so long was the sort of transformative experience that the young adults in our program had, and I just believe that everybody deserves to have that experience of making a difference. That if you think about Tom Brokaw writing about the greatest generation, and I just think that the thing that defined the greatest generation was their ability to serve, and to be not only recognized for their service, but to build the relationships and the understanding that service offered up. And when I think about the various, for doing it for 25 years, there were staff who started with us as coaches when they were right out of college, who are now, leading national nonprofit organizations, or the executive directors for local branches of their organizations. And there were kids who were, in the program as participants, who now actually work for us as coaches. Matt Bailey got to be on Good Morning America a couple of weeks ago, and he started off with us as a kid in the program, and he's now works for us. I think if you were to ask any of them, they would say that it was the experience of having this human who was connected to them and cared about them that actually just made all the difference in the world.
Yep. Great. Thank you for that. So building on talking about team, I recall what might be an apocryphal story, but I'm going to go with it anyway, of you as a cross-country champion, and how your team ran in a wedge, and how you were the tip of the wedge, and your teammates followed behind, and you finished together. And that was potentially a really powerful winning strategy. So whether that's a true story or not, I love the image, so we're going with it. And I'm a big fan of von Clausewitz and the whole idea of using a wedge, to concentrated force. But that again is a conversation for another time. So as you think about, metaphorically now, you and the vision you came through with Playworks, talk a little bit about translating that into, identifying, recruiting, inspiring a team, going from, as many of our students have an idea, a change that they want to make in the world, but how do they turn that into reality? How do they bring others in, to join them? How do they inspire and then, grow into being able to, direct and manage a team like that? I think it'd be really interesting for our students to hear that, Joe.
Yeah. I'm going to go with the wedge story. I'm a little, yes, but I really don't, I think you can't underestimate the importance of trust and rapport. And maybe it sounds almost sort of cliched, but I think the power of empathy in leadership, really. So, over the years, I started out not sort of poo-pooing business school when I was first launching my first nonprofit. And I think you were going off to business school and other people I knew were going off to business school. And I was just going to start this thing and do it. And I will say that probably about 10 years into running Playworks, I got way in over my head. And we got our big first investment from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. They gave us $4.4 million to take the organization to scale. And the wheels kind of came off the cart. Like I didn't do a good job of communicating where we were going. I didn't understand the extent to which that our needs as an organization were going to be changing. And I didn't bring people along. There were other things that weren't all my fault, but like the things that I could control, I was kind of out ahead of my skis as far as everybody else was concerned. And they didn't believe necessarily that I was going to make the best decisions for the whole organization, and certainly not for them. And it was one of the hardest sort of years of my life, where people that I'd built this thing with were super unhappy with me, and ultimately sort of decided many of them weren't going to stay. And it was a huge lesson for me about communicating. And there's a lot of talk about transparency, which I think a lot of times when you're running a bigger organization, transparency is challenging. It may not even be legal from a personnel standpoint, but I do think that people are completely justified in asking for visibility into the process. And I think a really amazing leader, whether you're on a team or running a workplace, really does make the effort to provide visibility into the process and to listen empathically and to be present in a way that that really not just makes people feel, but like genuinely conveys the extent to which you are in it together. And so I don't know. I do think it's a huge advantage to, as a woman leader in particular, but as a leader in general, to have had sports be such a big part of my growing up, because I think I just have always approached it, one, with a sort of recognition that you need the other person. Like, you just aren't going to win by yourself. Like LeBron James withstanding, like in general, you're like, you need, not only do you need your teammates, you need the loyal opposition. And figuring out when you're going to star and when you're going to pass and when you're going to go with the assist and how you're going to make sure that everybody's having a modicum of fun. I just think those are all the sort of essential lessons for play and leadership.
Fantastic, thank you. And you'll be pleased to know that, and I think our team at the Institute would back me up on this. We embed empathy, the idea of empathy, both the value of empathy, but also just the pragmatic importance of being able to use empathy to understand what's important to your team, to your customers, to your partners, as a core value in our ability to build successful organizations. Similarly, the importance of understanding the power of the network, right? And you mentioned that in your talk, and the ability to create the right connections, and your ability early on in Playworks to bring philanthropic organizations in. But over time, you transitioned, right, to, in focusing on building a sustainable, viable organization. I think a lot of times our students think about, well, you want to start, but how do you build something that's gonna, last over time? So it'd be great to hear a little bit about that transition from maybe an organization driven, at least funding wise, by philanthropy to one that looked to be self-sustaining.
Yeah. So we actually started with Playworks, at least at the outset, with earned revenue as a piece of the model. It wasn't the full, but it was always the sort of idea that we could cobble together kind of earned revenue with raised revenue. It's funny, it's a little bit of an ironic moment to be talking about this, because when the pandemic hit, actually our earned revenue was our Achilles heel. And I'm sure there are some who, having listened to me, crowed about how proud I was and how this made us more virtuous and superior in some ways. We're like, how the mighty tumble. But I still think it was the right thing to do, in no small part because I think out of respect for the customers that are the schools. I think, especially in a nonprofit, when there is that sort of avenue that's possible, um, relying on earned revenue in that way is almost as this baked in sort of um, regulator that ensures a level of program quality that I feel like um, that our communities with the least advantages absolutely deserve and haven't necessarily always had the levers to demand. And so I always felt like it was our ethos and how we operated, because of our like deep commitment to providing the highest quality programs. Um, so with the transition it was really about building and having a quality program where there was huge demand, and it was also about making sure that we understood the needs of our customers, right? So a lot of people who wanted to start different organizations would come and like, how do you get the schools to like take on your program? I'm like, well, you give them something they really believe they want and need. And so with Play, what was sort of ironic is that we weren't necessarily selling the outcomes of play and recess that we cared about the most. And a lot of times we were providing a service that helped schools address their group management problem at lunchtime and recess, because they were being held accountable to a really narrow set of standards around kids' sort of attendance and academic performance, and they needed a certain level of behavioral cooperation to achieve their goals, and recess not working well was a major obstacle to them being successful. So understanding and meeting schools where they were and where they are feels respectful and right, but also just like a really solid business practice.
Right. Great. Thank you for that, Jill. And I think it is an important lesson, none of us could have anticipated a pandemic or the impact that it has, but this reality of that agility and the balance, and some decisions do end up making us as entrepreneurs vulnerable to changes in the world and changes in market condition. But there are this sort of 10-year, and then there are the 1,000-year or 100-year at least case. It's can be very difficult to anticipate, but it's fantastic that Playworks has been able to to weather the pandemic. I want to go back to something you said about in your talk, and then but before I do, we'll remind everyone, please use Q&A for your questions. I have just one more after this, and then we're going to shift to your questions for Jill Vialet. So you mentioned this idea of muscles for justice and the role in play, and I want to read you a quote that you may recall. Inclusion, conflict resolution, taking turns, decision making, self-regulation, self-awareness, collaboration, empathy, all the skills required for people to engage in civil society are things you learn in play. First off, I couldn't endorse that statement more. Second off, I would argue that many of us have lost our way on that, in the recent past. Talk a little about this idea of social justice and the role that play and the role that social entrepreneurship can play in helping us find our way again. And I know it's a weighty question, and it's probably even a little bit unfair, but you've been doing this for a long time and have had an unbelievable impact in the communities you've been part of and have seen it. And I think it'd be really valuable for our students to hear from you about it.
Sure. Well, I'll sort of answer it inside out, and then I ultimately probably will answer your question, but maybe not. I've been having this just tremendous experience of late, as I'm trying to figure out what I want to be when I grow up. I've been talking to lots of different folks who are working. They wouldn't necessarily call themselves social entrepreneurs. They might actually be more likely to refer to themselves as democracy entrepreneurs. But they are people who are working in the space, the nonprofit space, kind of addressing sometimes tactical fixes to our democracy, things that come like ranked choice voting, efforts to sort of redress gerrymandering. There's a whole range, a lot of stuff around civic engagement, civic education. There's been just this sort of a real rise in the number of these organizations. There was a big surge in 2004, and then since 2016, there's been really significant amount of growth in this area. And it's super fun for me to talk with these leaders because where they are in their journey just feels super familiar, like to where Playworks was 10 years ago in our efforts to sort of scale our intervention. And so, and I'm sure that, for-profit entrepreneurs who have had sort of similar experience talking to social entrepreneurs and like, oh, you're starting a business, you're hiring people, you're dealing with management challenges and stuff. So that's just been, it's just been very hopeful too, because the people I've met working in this space really just bring a level of energy and enthusiasm and optimism. There's the great John Gardner quote, right? That America today faces breathtaking opportunities disguised as insoluble problems. And I just find that attitude like, isn't this awesome? It's so broken. We can totally fix it. It's that which has been great. That said, I'm also just struck, and again, there's a parallel between sort of the role of play in democracy and this idea of the joyful revolutionary, and I just over and over again when I watch what happens in schools where Playworks is present, and you watch how the dynamic on the playground evolves, and how leadership emerges in lots of different places, and kids actually get to, without it being super didactic and lectured about this is how we do this, and they get to actually experientially learn how much we need each other, and to have the experience of resolving their own conflicts,
Yeah.
and to recognize that like having a conflict isn't the end of the world. Like it's natural, and we can have conflicts and still get along, and agree to disagree, or just have that conflict be an ongoing truth in our environment. And they're just all these very practical, and they're almost cliched, but just ways in which if you watch kids play, it's just so clear that they are having experiences that if we can, as a grown-ups, stay in touch with those basic skills about self handicapping, for example, like just the very idea that we could be playing hockey and Jill and Joe, you switch teams to make the teams more even, that it just feels like it's so natural for kids, and they lean into it, and as grown-ups we are so reticent, right? And
yeah, it's so funny. Recalling back, you've flashed me back to my to being a volunteer parent helping with play activities. My kids were in elementary school, and watching the kids self-organize and play Foursquare, and you realize if we could run our government like that, we would be a heck of a lot better off. And that is not a political statement, just one with reality.
I've had a couple of different friends have suggested that I apply for the job of like Secretary of Play for the United States, and that I could really just have a prime focus on bringing rock, paper, scissors to Congress, that could be a whole sort of next phase of my career. But there we go.
I think I'm in. I endorse.
There we go.
All right. So we're going to move to our Q&A. I have one final question for Jill. So your book's title, Why Playworks, Big Changes Start Small. I think a lot of our students are thinking about how do I take that first step? And I'm a big fan of the Tao Te Ching and Benjamin Hoff's book, The Day of Piglet and the Virtue of the Small. Talk for a moment. How do you back to this? How do you start? How do the small? How do you find that that small start?
Yeah. I say this all the time. So it matters how it feels. And so if for your students, you don't actually have to be the person to like start something. The experience of finding people that you really enjoy working with, and being a part of something, cutting your teeth, learning alongside, really being making yourself an invaluable contributor. Those are the sort of initial experiences, I think, that set people up to really learn as much as possible. I would say bringing a sort of sort of an infinite curiosity to whatever it is that
Mm.
you're engaged with. You know, the people who show up, who are curious and are willing to do what it takes to make the thing happen, who don't pretend the obstacles aren't there, but don't see them as insurmountable. Those are the people that you want to be around and that you want to affect change with, and those are the people that you will figure out how to, if you to find the right seat on the bus with them, to sort of paraphrase Jim Collins in a weird way. But I just
Yeah.
think I think that the thing to do is to start. I think if you're waiting for the perfect opportunity, you could wait forever. Um, it's you got to ship, and you're gonna make mistakes, and if you brush yourself off and get going and keep laughing and offer other people a hand up when they've fallen down, you're just way more likely to get a lot farther.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Thank you for that, Jill. And I got to tell you, you're crushing it with these two words: infinite curiosity, messy interdependence, and of course, joyful revolutionary. You got a future in copywriting, I'm pretty sure.
Or speaking, soundbite. I'm a little concerned actually.
Either way. So we're going to move to questions. If you haven't had a chance yet to offer one in Q&A, please do. And we will do our best to get to as many of them as we can. So I'm going to build on the first question. Will build on what you just talked about, and it's from someone who's a freshman in high school. And the question is, how did you first start knowing what you wanted to do in college and your projects? How did you determine what you were most passionate about? And how did you find your way through, the many things that you've done? And thank you for your question. And thank you as a high school freshman for joining us this evening.
Awesome. So I would say that, like, the key for me has been that when a door gets opened, my orientation is to walk through it. And so I would say, like, with starting Mocha, I started Mocha when I was 23 years old, and the spark for that was that I had accepted a job. My first job, really, out of college, was teaching Eskimo kids how to swim up in Alaska through campfire boys and girls. And I just thought, oh, that sounds like a great job. I don't have to wear real shoes. And they're going to fly me in this little biplane in and out of these, like, remote villages. And I was stationed along sort of outside of Bethel, along in a town called Shawethbalak. And I was doing art with the kids, and we were hanging it on the walls. And I was teaching swimming, and it was really, really cold. So you didn't want to swim all day. So I would do art too. And just that was the inspiration for actually then later starting the Children's Art Museum in Oakland. There was an earthquake in Oakland, and there were all these kids that had been relocated to shelters, and I was trying to figure out what I could do to help. And I went in, and having done art in Alaska, I started doing art there, and we convinced the city folks at City Hall to let us hang the art, and that was the beginning. So I think, and then you sort of sometimes, I know this sounds a little woo-woo, but sometimes it just feels like you find yourself on this ride and an idea takes on a life of its own, and all you can do is white knuckle it and hold on as tight as you can and follow it where the idea takes you. And so being open to that experience and following ideas and going where the energy takes you has really served me.
And that's sage advice, Jill. I think sometimes it is tough, right? For students to have that comfort. It's more than a little bit of letting go, right? And recognizing. And Jonathan Reckford talked about this in his talk back in the fall of having a good idea about the change you want to have in the world, but not necessarily knowing the path. And that's typical, for those of you in high school and college joining us this evening. We all go through that, right? And sometimes things happen serendipitously, doors open, and we follow through. And it's hard though. It is, it's not easy to let go and being open to those kinds of changes and those kinds of opportunities.
And I would say at 56, having started a few different successful ones, and now turning towards the sort of knowing that I'm drawn to something in the democracy space and play and justice, and but not necessarily knowing what the next exact right thing is. it's both mildly terrifying and like, and also just humbling and like, and I just gotta believe that just keep on swimming.
Yep. Indeed. That's fantastic. Um, so our next question, Jill, is about it's kind of back on the one of the last questions I asked you, which is the idea of play being a building block for justice. So you think about kind of as an early educator, what do you think is a top trait or characteristic that will benefit students and all of us in the classroom? The things that you think, we can be emphasizing as educators, not just in K-12, I would argue, certainly in higher ed as well, that really move forward, our pursuit of justice for everyone.
Yeah. I've been, it's a little unfair, but I'm writing the book right now. And I was just writing a whole part about the importance of volition in play. That when you define play, it's one of those, I hope this is okay, but it sort of plays a little bit like pornography in that you know it when you see it, and it's hard to sort of define, which is a little off color for a definition of play, but nonetheless.
It's apt.
But I do think that one of the things that really distinguishes play is that kids get to choose it. And so I am struck by, in thinking about our experience with Playworks and bringing play into schools, what an incredible luxury and gift it has been to be the grown-up in a school who has the greater latitude to create spaces where kids can have a lot of choice and voice, right? Because so many educators are in this place where they're being held accountable to a pretty narrow set of standards. And then also just the dynamics of the classroom, that it's really hard as an adult if a kid's having a bad moment and being some way that might be perceived as disrespectful, to be able to step back and say, wow, maybe something else is going on here. How do I, not clamp down on this child who's having a behavioral moment, and give them almost the opposite of what our impulse is, to give them more choice and voice and give them more control in that moment. Our whole educational system, and I was a high school teacher, and I remember having this like moment of abject terror that the students were going to really like understand how completely not in control I was of the classroom. But school is really so often built around controlling what happens with students. And I think the extent to which we can suspend our disbelief in kids' capacity to be drivers of their own education, to self-organize and to self-regulate, to create more opportunities for them to take risks. Even though we live in this incredibly litigious society and there's so much fear, it is antithetical to sort of the inefficient, sort of courageous environments that actually, I think, contribute to learning.
Yeah. It is difficult because we've built up a structure over time that really is, developed around a particular model, a model that's, for K-12, 100 plus years old. And I think your point's well taken.
The other thing one of my favorite other definitions about play is any activity undertaken for no apparent purpose. And I'm just constantly, I think the sort of, and I'm going to go back on the fluent soundbite, but like the tyranny of apparent purpose. I just feel like the extent to which educators, especially early childhood educators, can just like be encouraged to let kids do it just because. And I just increasingly, as we are testing for kindergartners and that motion, I want to go the other direction. I want play into high school. And so.
No, I think you're right. And I think you would be the most popular person in our household right now if you talk to my two teenagers about choice and voice and no apparent purpose, because I believe those are the two major themes currently flowing about.
Yes.
In a good way.
Yes.
So next question comes this idea of there's a couple questions here, so I apologize for those asked. I'm going to kind of merge them and talk about, education and running Playworks and just being a social entrepreneur in COVID, right? And all the challenges that it presents. So, and it's probably a two-part question, Jill, but the first is thinking about education in this environment, and particularly play, and then secondarily, just generally how you've been able to cope with, and your thoughts on kind of addressing the real sea change that the pandemic has had for virtually every organization.
Yeah. Well, so over the summer, I wrote, and with the Playworks team, we put out a free ebook, the Playworks Reopening Workbook, and it's online. If you go to playworks.org/workbook, I think you can download that there, and really tried to tease out, as schools were reopening or thinking about reopening, how we actually might think about this moment as a chance to build back better, that not just returning to normal, but what were the opportunities that this break in how we have been doing things, what were the different new approaches that we might incorporate, and how might we much more intentionally engage both students and families, along with faculty and staff and administrators, in kind of building schools that worked for all of us. And using the framework of play was really fun, because the workbook, it's broken into sort of 4 sections. One, we're starting with thinking about transitions, because transitions are so huge in play, right? They are these interstitial moments when things are so likely to break down. But when really handled playfully and intentionally, transitions can be incredibly rich spaces.
Mhm.
And then the other sections of the book are rituals, rules, and referees, and thinking about those sort of fundamental play, sort of building blocks in this moment with COVID. And so much about how COVID and the pandemic are addressed are about us collectively agreeing to certain rules, and how we are going to sort of assure mutual accountability, and then creating rituals as a way to really um, create buy-in and ensure visibility into the process, all those things we've been talking about. So that's one thing I'm thinking about, like, how do you actually create an inclusive and participatory, on some level, I would just say too, like, if you think about this moment and all the sort of logistical and ethical and sort of competing realities that this moment lays bare, if you thought about it as just one giant project-based learning experience for kids, like, it's such a rich moment. The literature of the moment, the science of the moment, the math of the moment, that this it's so applied and relevant to kids' lives. It just feels to me like, if we can't figure out how to make this an engaging way to have kids consider the world and how they want it to look and who they want to be, then we really just, as adults, should all get fired. Okay, I just feel like that's so. And then the other thing I was going to flash on, I mentioned it. I started a nonprofit called Substantial. We have a book coming out on April 6th. Super excited about that. Called Substantial: Redesigning the Substitute Teaching Experience. And this moment, the book was supposed to come out in the summer, and I went to the publisher and said, no, this is not the right moment to be releasing a book. No one is thinking about substitute teaching, but people are thinking about substitute teaching right now. It's so essential, right? Because we're just coming to realize how much we need these educators who actually pre-pandemic spent about 10% of a kid's education were in the front of the classrooms for kids. And it's just this woefully underdesigned part of the educational system. And one of the kind of weird bright spots about the pandemic is people are starting to recognize how critical that role is, and how critical these educators are to the experience, and how relationships are really at the core of it being a successful kind of part of the school day. And so the the very short answer now that I've wound around to get to is that ultimately, I think education, what is being totally laid bare right now by the pandemic, by this moment of national racial reckoning, is that education is nothing without relationships. And figuring out how we put those at the center of how we build schools is the key.
Yeah. Wow, that's a powerful statement, Joe. Um, Absolutely. Um, so let's talk for a moment about we've got a couple of questions around that I'm gonna sort of combine to this notion of sliding door moments, right? Those times when you in your career and your personal life and whatever have a choice to make about picking door A or door B, taking a right or taking a left. And you've talked eloquently previously and tonight about it's often organic and you need to be opportunistic and open-minded. um, but where do you draw strength from, guidance, when you're making these decisions, when you're in that moment, how do you make them? I think that's a really, helpful thing to share. We talk a lot about it in our entrepreneurship academies, and we have panelists come in and talk about not so much the decision they made, but the process they went through and who they involved in making that decision. So maybe you could share a little bit about that, one or two examples from your career.
Yeah. So I have two that come to mind. And I think I'm probably officially an ambivert, but I have a pretty strong introverted side, and I'm a somatic learner in a lot of ways. So I actually do a lot of thinking and processing while moving. I think I have when you first said it, the first thing I flashed on um, was going for a run on Stinson Beach and thinking about a decision about whether I was going to stay or go at Mocha. And another time, like I love to backpack. And this summer, um, being out backpacking in the Trinity Alps and really thinking about, okay, do I want to write this book? And deciding that I did. And so I feel like there is a way that when I am out in nature and moving in my body, that I am able to be present with myself in a very full full way that offers clarity for me.
Yeah.
Um, I also then I have a group of close friends and advisors um, who I believe love me and know me and are not fooled by any of the hype and will tell me when I'm being a jerk. Um, and I think that's incredibly useful. And so, and they'll also tell me when I'm being too hard on myself, which is also incredibly useful because I think I'm capable of doing both. So, um, being willing to just talk out loud about what I'm thinking and to really lay all my cards on the table for the people in my sort of circle of support. I've heard other people have described having their own personal board of directors, which I've never done, but I actually think it's a really sort of brilliant strategy. And I think I have a group of sort of trusted advisors. They're not quite a board. They don't have that much, they don't get to make the decision, but I have control issues.
Right. Well, the kitchen cabinet is the sort of
Yeah.
proverbial example.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's great.
Yeah. I'll just say, I'm reading Obama's book, The Promised Land
Yeah.
We just started. And just the way he talks about like, he has a particularly all-star, kitchen cabinet, but it was
Yeah.
really sort of like, oh, I don't know. I thought that was fun.
Yeah, I'm enjoying that read as well. So time for a couple more questions, Joel. I love that answer. So one is about, and I know you've addressed this in some of your talks before, but I think it'd be great for our students and others to hear about, sometimes school districts have particularly high performing school districts have a challenge balancing emphasizing play with emphasizing academics and this perceived value, if you're a high performing district, that you get measured on your academic performance as a district and not necessarily on your play performance. So as you kind of think about that, what's the selling points, for a community around the importance of play as something that communities should invest in their education, and that it's not at odds with academics, but it's actually, what's the Latin, mens sana in corpore sano, right? The whole idea of sound mind and
Gesundheit.
sound body.
Yes. Yeah. No, well, I don't, I'm going to just come at you and sort of undercut the whole premise of your question. That, in fact, what we've seen across the country is that play is first and foremost an equity issue, and that disproportionately high performing districts, affluent independent schools, they're way more likely to have play available to their kids. I think it's much more the fields of Eton, that there is a sort of an awareness
Yeah.
that those experiences are what breed leadership. Um, and it is the schools where they are underperforming, where administrators and educators feel like so much pressure to show improvements on their test scores that they feel like they have to take a very short-term perspective and feel like they can't justify it. And the research is categorical that actually, kids need actually the time outside playing. They need the break time. John Rady's book Spark
Yeah.
talks about the Naperville schools and makes a very sort of categorical argument around the importance of physical activity and academic performance. I mean, we're on a different part of the spectrum with more play-based physical activity, but we did do a randomized control trial, Stanford Graduate School of Education and Mathematica Policy Research, and they looked at 29 schools, 17 that had Playworks and 12 match schools that didn't. And they found 4 statistically significant findings. We recovered a significant amount of instructional time. We had a dramatic impact on reducing bullying. We increased vigorous physical activity, which if there's like one like universal good thing, like if that had been, it is vigorous physical activity. And then the 4th was that we increased kids' sense of safety, not just during recess, but throughout the school day. And just from an ability to learn standpoint, you have to feel safe before you can learn.
Yeah. That was a very powerful response,
Sure.
Jill. And I think it also, no, it emphasizes the importance not just of, of having a passion, having a good idea, of believing it, but being able to, you talked about, the ideas are, can be a dime a dozen, but it's implementing it, it's executing it. And
Yeah,
part
I
of it
was
is
not in charge of the evaluation for sure. That's like
fair enough. But part of that execution is being able to demonstrate the value of what you're doing, right? And the research that you've conducted, that unequivocally shows the power and the impact of the program is not just important in being able to measure it, but also in gaining the confidence of district school systems that this is the right thing to do. Because I think often, school districts are faced with the challenge of, well, this seems like a good idea, but what proof do I have, or how do I, how can I make this decision comfortably and know that that I'm making the right one? And so, the research is an important piece of this. I think students, as you think about the impact you want to have, being able to measure that impact, and being willing to risk, well, I don't know, let's learn and see what's having impact and what isn't, is a really important piece of this.
Yeah.
Great. So I think we have time for maybe one more question, and then I'm going to turn it back over to you, Jill, for a wrap-up statement. I think this is a good one, and again embodies several of the questions that we've received. So for those of you that asked a specific one, thank you for your indulgence in allowing me to combine them. So how do you build and maintain a sustainable organization over time? And I'm going to interpret sustainability as, sustainability of the mission, sustainability of your energy and enthusiasm and that of the team, and the sustainability in an evolving environment, scaling, changes in culture, changes in priorities, changes in funding. From your experience over 25 years in Playworks, what's been the key to your ability to, to create a sustainable enterprise?
Yeah, I'll answer it in a couple of different ways. I mean, one I think is building a really solid team with uh, a lot people bringing a complementary set of strategic skills. So it took me a while to really fully understand that financial leadership was just a strategic capacity that needed to be just as sort of integrated into the sort of program design and management as anything else within our organization. Um, we also, I think, um, really just figuring out how do you create a kind of communications plan and a capacity around both internal and external marketing that advances the mission. There's so many ways in which um, storytelling and creating a narrative around what you do, it's not just sales or spin. It really is about how you achieve systems change. Um,
Mm.
and I think ultimately it is shifting from a focus on outputs and the things that you can claim responsibility for to a real emphasis on outcomes. And at one point during Playworks, we really made the shift from being obsessed with like the numbers of schools we were serving to really focusing more on the outcome that there be safe and healthy play for for kids across America. And if that meant us training Boys and Girls Club staff to deliver it, then so be it. If that was the most cost effective way to change the system, then that was really what we needed to really focus on. And I think the system is in a lot of ways built to reinforce an emphasis on outputs. That's what funders invest in.
Yeah.
But I think that changing mindset where you focus on outcomes instead, which then sort of comes back to the question itself, I think you could make the case that actually sustainability isn't the goal. The goal should be solving the challenge that you face and address. And so um, I don't want to put us out of business until we've actually achieved that. But it would be amazing if there was safe and healthy play at every school in America and that there was an opportunity to serve um, when you graduated from college or high school as a Playworks like coach by whatever you called it at every elementary school in America, and that there wasn't a need for us anymore. That would be better.
Mhm. You're one of the few entrepreneurs that we've heard ever say that, but I endorse and hear your truth, Ms. Violet. Um, and thank you for your candid responses. I think sometimes it's most important for our students to hear, the truth, right? And the reality of not just the challenges of building a social enterprise and having the impact you want to have, but the trade-offs that you have to make. And then the reality of, I love the Boys and Girls Clubs example, right? Is keeping your eye on the prize of what change are we trying to affect, and why do we exist? And sometimes you're right. I suppose why we exist is to go out of business
Mhm.
at some point. Um, our colleagues in the for-profit side of the world may feel just slightly less comfortable with that approach. But that's not what we're talking about this evening.
Yeah.
So first, on behalf of the Mike and Renee Child Institute for Innovation and Entrepreneurship at UC Davis, I want to thank you so much for your time, for your wisdom, for your insights. It's through these kinds of conversations that our students get exposed to and really are able to assimilate the important experiences and wisdom of the folks that have gone before them. And just personally, I'm so grateful for your, willingness to engage with us. It's fantastic to see you, and I want to turn it back to you for any final comments you want to make, any wrap-up statement.
Well, I just think the one thing that, as we've been talking and thinking about the students in particular, but in general, anybody who's thinking about how they might make a contribution in this moment, I've just been thinking a lot about sort of it's something that's actually come up more with substantial and sort of and people who want to be substitute teachers. But I think it was Carl Jung who made the observation that humans need the opportunity for meaning, mastery, and community. And this is a moment, I think, where there are an abundant there's an abundance of opportunity to actually make a difference. But leaning into it with the attitude that you are going to learn by contributing, and that pursuit of meaning, but with an attitude that you have so much to learn, and then ultimately that you will go the furthest if you go with others in community. I just think that when people are feeling uncertain about which direction to go, you were asking that, go right or go left, which door do I open? I'd say if you're looking and if you can peek through and it looks like, ooh, there's a real opportunity for achieving meaning and mastery and community, then I'd pick that door.
Awesome. Thank you, Jill. We really appreciate it. And thank you to everyone who joined us this evening for this Think, Do, Discover Fireside Chat with Jill Vialet, the founder of Playworks, among many other things. Thank you to the Davis Entrepreneurial Network for your support. And we look forward to seeing you again at our next talk in the spring. So good night to everybody. And again, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much.